Hello, welcome to the Nomiki Show. You are watching one of our holiday pre-tapes. I am Nomiki Const, of course. This holiday season, we're giving our team a break, but we're also providing content every day because you guys, there's a lot going on in the world and it's hard to keep up. So we decided we would do these extra interviews, in-depth interviews with leaders, with journalists, with reporters, so that you can keep your brain fed over the holidays and not be playing games like I've been doing basically nonstop. Anyways, I'm excited to introduce our guest today, which is Tim Schwab. He is a journalist. He has been writing extensively about the Gates Foundation as part of his fellowship with the Alicia Patterson Foundation. He has written a series of 4 articles in The Nation and the Columbia Journalism Review about Bill Gates's multi-billion dollar, foundation, the Gates Foundation, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and really how effective they are at the measures that they're putting forward regarding public health. So first off, thanks for joining us, Tim. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
I mean, everybody knows of Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. It's pretty much everywhere you look. They've expanded their focus on everything from politics to public health to infrastructure. What inspired you to look into basically into the foundation, how effective they've been in their work?
In journalism, the Gates Foundation gets covered widely, and you've seen that a lot during the COVID pandemic, where there's been thousands of articles about the Gates Foundation, but there's virtually no critical reporting. And that's been the case for probably the last decade. So it's really into that vacuum that, I saw a real opportunity and I'd say a need to do some critical investigative reporting. This is a charity, but I think we should also see it as a political organization. We should see it as a structure of power. It's an extremely powerful group that influences public policy, like you said, everything from global health to education to agriculture.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's the job of journalists to hold power to account. So that sort of became the entry point. The last investigative series on the Gates Foundation of any substance was in 2007 by the LA Times.
Wow. Is that just because investigative reporting is sort of a dying industry because it's not being funded?
Yeah, that's definitely part of it. I think it's hard to look askance at the Gates Foundation because it's charity. This is a billionaire who's giving away all of his money. Why would you want to put a critical lens on that? There's so many targets and so little resources to do investigative journalism. That has to be one reason. But I will add, this summer I did a long feature in Columbia Journalism Review, looking at the hundreds of millions of dollars that the Gates Foundation has donated to journalism. And
Right.
if you're a newsroom receiving funding from the Gates Foundation, how eager are you going to be to put a critical lens on the Gates Foundation? So to answer your question, I think there's a lot of reasons, but certainly the dying art, trade, craft of investigative journalism is one reason.
So in your piece, Bill Gates's billions distorting public health data, you explore IMHE. Could you tell us first off what IMHE is and sort of the monopoly power that they have over global health, accountability, et cetera?
Yeah, this is like the wonkiest article I've ever written. So this is an article about health metrics, but somehow it managed to be the most read article of the nation for a full week. So the Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation is this research institute at the University of Washington, which is in Seattle, which is where the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is. So they've kind of reached a new level of fame or notoriety during the pandemic because they've been a leading producer of projections for COVID deaths and infections. So you'll see IHME on the news all the time. They're on CNN regularly. They're quoted widely in the news about how many deaths we're going to see with COVID.
Right.
But a decade before that, they were producing all kinds of metrics and estimates and evaluations about anything and everything related to global health and development. They have these colorful maps where you can zoom in to virtually any village in sub-Saharan Africa and find out how much education somebody has, how much, who has piped water, and how many men are circumcised. It's like really granular data.
Mm-hmm.
And by producing these estimates, these are really important for global health because you sort of need to know, who's sick and where, who's
Right.
dying and where in the world they're dying in order to know how to prioritize aid spending, for example. So these estimates that the IHME produces are really important, but really influential. But its critics say, so the tie-in here, the Gates Foundation created the IHME and has funded it with $600 million. Just
So
like
they created an organization that is supposed to essentially, I mean, is it fair to go as far and say it's a regulatory organization, or is it just a tracking? I mean, they're keeping account and there's data, but is it through accountability, or is it just to report?
Um, it's not regulatory, but it does see itself as kind of playing a watchdog role, because it wants to see, as all these different governments and aid agencies are spending money, they want to see
Right.
how effective that money has been spent, and to help guide priorities for how money is spent going forward. But at the end of the day, they are a university research institute.
Okay.
Um, but because their estimates are so widely used by governments, academic researchers, philanthropies, they really have a lot of influence at the end of the day on a kind of policy or budgetary decision about where money is spent. And a lot of academic scholars who work in global health charge that this institute has become like too big to peer review even. They have so much money and so many resources from the Gates Foundation that they have what critics and what a lot of scholars call monopoly power. And
Interesting.
that's really antithetical to the way science is supposed to work, where you're supposed to have researchers competing on an even playing field, challenging each other, debate, discourse, and incrementally, you produce the best knowledge out of that process. But what scholars are saying in global health is that that's not really happening with the IHME. And that's because they have such outsized resources from the Gates Foundation.
Is the Gates Foundation, with this data, with this information, are they making the case that their projects, say AIDS, their AIDS project, for instance, or malaria project, or I don't pick a
Mhm.
project, that it's successful? Because obviously a foundation has to produce sort of their I don't know if it's annually or if it's every quarter they have to produce what they've been able to get done, and what their challenges are. Is it, are they moving forward? I mean, are they actually, is the money I have this memory of, I'm sorry to
Yeah.
go off on a tangent, but
Yeah.
I remember when maybe a decade ago when everybody was talking about water in Africa, right?
Mhm.
And they started putting these water pumps in villages or drills in villages, and
Mhm.
then it was great for like 2 weeks, and then they'd break, and there was no follow-up or maintenance happening. And so and I think a lot of folks, they called out certain water organizations, essentially saying like you didn't have any long-term goals, you just had an immediate goal because you were quarterly. And so there
Right.
was this foundation nonprofit complex, um, that was affecting very serious projects and the health of many folks that they were hoping to help. So I guess metrics wise, are they actually accomplishing their goals?
Yeah, well, I mean, the reality is because the IHME produces estimates and metrics for anything and everything under the sun, everybody uses those estimates. So if you were going to try to look at the effectiveness of this water project or a well project or
Right.
malaria or anything, you would go to IHME's metrics and you would look at what were the numbers a decade ago, what were the numbers, this year, and you can kind
Right.
of see, are they changing? And is that change justify continued spending on this kind of research project? Somebody told me as I was, researching this article that, whether you give malaria, whether you give aid funding to cover malaria in this country or that country, those kinds of questions are what really you look to the IHME to get those kinds of answers. And at a certain point, this kind of determines what can and can't be done in global health, what these numbers
Hmm.
say.
Okay.
So should all that power be at one research institute that by many accounts is kind of uncontestable, unchallengeable because by dint of its great power? And behind that should, this white billionaire in Seattle be in charge of that, be funding it?
So in terms of what they have been able to, I mean, you say that some of the information has just been flat out wrong, that there are conflicts of interest internally. Can we talk about just sort of the ecosystem of how this other than just being funded by Bill Gates and his foundation, um, what are some of the internal problems that they have that make their information flawed, their data flawed?
So science is, I think it's helpful for people to think about science the way they think about politics and to put a money and power lens on science. At the end of the day, we would like to think of science as being sort of a really impartial and neutral and objective process, but it's a very human process and is subject to all kinds of biases, including from financial interests. So that's why you have, in the same way you have all sorts of checks and balances over politics, you have the same checks and balances over science, where the Gates Foundation is the primary funder of the IHME, could insist that this research institute follow all the ethical rules about disclosing its financial conflicts of interest, ethical rules about authorship. Only those authors that make the most significant, meaningful contribution should be listed as authors. And you can kind of go down the line. You also have academic journals. For science to really enter the scientific discourse, it gets published in these academic journals like The Lancet. It's one of the leading medical journals, and it's where IHME has published more of their studies in The Lancet than any other journal. Mm-hmm. So The Lancet has a great deal, as an important oversight rule to play, or along these same things. Is the peer review process happening as it should? So your listeners probably know, but in peer review, you want to publish a study in The Lancet, you submit it. The editor gives it to 3 or 4 of your peers, other researchers who are experts. They take a look at it and judge the merits of it. The editor looks at that and publishes based on that. What scholars say widely is that peer review process really isn't working. They describe it almost as a kind of a pro forma, where the IHME submits these studies to The Lancet and they just go to publication. I mean, they are being peer reviewed, but they're just 5,000 pages of appendices with all these numbers and estimates and metrics. The scholars say you just can't really peer review that. So all that to say, there are all these checks and balances and accountability measures in place, but are they working? That's the question. Yeah.
Can we talk a little bit about their COVID-19 data? I mean, this has been a big, obviously huge part of the last year, and if they're this flawed, are we getting the wrong information?
Yeah, so I mean, the reason why this article, it's kind of interesting. I wrote this article a year ago, but the context for it really changed because during COVID, IHME suddenly became this public figure because it was producing these leading estimates with COVID. And, some of its first estimates were, they thought that COVID would be much less severe than it really was. So they were imagining it would, wind down by June and the pandemic would be over. And that happened to kind of align with the Trump administration, which was trying to downplay the pandemic. And so you saw press conferences where the Trump administration was citing IHME data. And then that creates kind of a vicious cycle where the news media is citing IHME's data. So yeah, their initial estimates, they got things really wrong. And people said they got them wrong in a very kind of predictable way. They used a wrong model. They were doing these kind of projections in a really unorthodox way that other modelers, their peers, wouldn't have done. They said it was obvious it was going to produce these kinds of problems. And scholars in global health sort of describe that as kind of part and parcel of how the IHME works. They're willing to, push the data further and push the projections and the models and the metrics in different ways, and certainly further than other modelers would. Later on in the pandemic, they were projecting the course of COVID deaths and infections months in advance, whereas most other modelers were just doing 1 or 2 months in advance. And, so it's examples like that where the IHME is doing things that other modelers aren't.
I mean, and it's so, as we all are armchair experts on this now, it's
Yeah.
it's so reflective of over what the government's policies are going to be. I mean, do you go into shutdown? Do you not go into shutdown? Do you have a mask mandate? Do you shut your borders down, et cetera, et cetera? So how can they predict 6 months in advance just logically? That's not a smart take.
Right. I mean, a lot of people thought that we were going to have a spike during the winter because of the weather, because of
Right.
traveling for the holidays. And here we are, we have a spike. So you can make kind of estimated guesses, which at a certain point, that's what all these projections and all these modelers are doing. But, at a certain point, there has to be some sense of humility, an acknowledgement of the uncertainty in what you're doing, and also an ability to step up to the plate when you err and say,
Right.
an issue of mea culpa.
So that goes to my last question. What has been their response? Has there been any sort of accountability? Has this created a stir? Are folks demanding, reform or change?
Yeah, I mean, the piece was, really widely cited on social media. Hundreds of academics went on Twitter, and a lot of them started sharing their own stories about trying to work with the IHME, asking them to show data, basic levels of transparency, not getting it. Other researchers are saying that their own careers, like their ability to get research funding, they can't get research funding because the other grant funders will say, well, the IHME already does this. Why would we fund you?
Oh,
It kind
wow.
of speaks to their monopoly power.
Yeah.
So, all these academics took to social media to describe their own sort of stories of woe interfacing with the IHME. If or how that translates into some kind of change with how the world of health metrics remains to be seen. This article was published a few days ago. At the end of the day, it really comes down to this triumvirate of Bill Gates, who funds the IHME, the IHME itself, and then the Lancet, the editor of the Lancet, Richard Horton. Those are the kind of the three pieces that could really move this. Well, there's the University of Washington too. If they wanted to bring some accountability, they could. So I don't know. It's early days. We'll see.
It sounds like this all comes down to monopolies, something that Bill Gates, of course, knows a lot about.
Right.
Fascinating set of articles, and research. And I mean, I'm no public health expert by any means, but I think it's really interesting to see this overlap of foundational money and how it affects literally every aspect of our life, especially in a pandemic. So, I mean, just breaking apart the infrastructure is really interesting. So thanks for doing that. Very interesting work, but also not necessarily sexy.
Yeah.
All right, Tim, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks for watching and listening to The Nomiki Show. But remember to click like and subscribe on YouTube, and please share on social media. If you're not already a patron, please join us for as low as $5 a month on patreon.com/The Nomiki Show for early and special content. That investment makes a huge difference. We are not corporate media raking in the dough. It's really you guys that are keeping us going. So please consider being a patron. And to our current patrons, thank you so much. We are incredibly grateful to you. We also now have Schwab. So check us out on thenomikishow.com to get your mugs, your totes, and your stickers.